Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining today. We're here to talk about how to turn the Department of War Zero Trust for OT framework into real enforceable security. Zero Trust isn't a future idea anymore, but a mandated strategy. The challenge now is making it real, especially in mission-critical operational environments where the stakes are high. Today, we'll explore the Zero Trust actually looks like in defense settings, how it applies to operational technology and mission systems, and what success really means in practice. Earlier, Department of War guidance focused on enterprise IT. This newer guidance builds on that, extending zero trust principles into operational environments, things like industrial control systems, facilities, and logistics infrastructure. But OT isn't the same as IT. These environments have strict requirements around safety, uptime, legacy systems. So the framework adapts zero trust in a way that strengthens security without disrupting critical operations. The guidance lays out more than 100 activities across key areas like users, devices, applications, data, networks, automation, and analytics. These are designed to help organizations implement things like identity-based access, segmentation, and continuous verification. Next slide. A bit of housekeeping. If you have questions, please use the Q&A function in the webinar platform. We'll answer your questions at the end. We will share a recording and additional information after the webinar. Next slide. Introductions. Myself, Pat Park, I'm the VP of Federal at Xage Security. Daryl Haegley, Technical Director, Department of Air Force Cyber Resilience Office for Control Systems, otherwise known as CROS. Daryl has extensive experience in industrial control systems and operational technology security, with deep knowledge of how to apply zero trust principles in mission-critical environments. Daryl, did you want to add some additions to the background?
Well, thanks. Glad to be part of this and always enjoy talking about OT and then especially zero trust. We in the Department of the Air Force, representing the Air Force and the Space Force, have developed this first office focused on all of OT and coordinating it across the department, as mentioned, from security forces, manufacturing, engineering, airfield lighting, fire life safety, all the cyber requirements, all the essentially personnel processes and training, and bringing those all together to get a cyber defensive posture. Great to be here.
Thank you. And Dr. John Sahlin, VP of Cyber Solutions at GDIT. John brings to his role deep expertise in intelligence and cybersecurity leadership from his prior work within the Navy. He has been directly involved in shaping and implementing cybersecurity strategy in mission-critical defense environments. John, additions?
Yeah, thank you, everyone, and thank you, Pat, for having me on this panel. This is an important element of overall cybersecurity, particularly with regard to the Department of War and implementations, as we've seen through a variety of actions, tests, and even simple pranks. A few years ago at DEF CON, a gentleman described his senior high school prank that he basically rickrolled his entire school district by hacking into their operational technology systems. So this is meant to underscore how important, while it was funny and entertaining, it also underscored how important critical infrastructure is, things like operational technology systems. So I'm excited to talk about that today.
Thank you. And Roman Arutyunov is the co-founder and head of products at Xage Security. Xage is a company focused on zero trust access protection for distributed and operational environments. Roman, do you want to give some additional input?
Yes, thank you, Pat. And hello, everyone. So my name is Roman Arutyunov. I'm one of the founders, and I'm heading up products at Xage Security. So my background is really a combination of cybersecurity, industrial networking, and industrial automation. So which what makes it really unique. I spent about earlier part of my career protecting some of the largest enterprises. And then I got involved in industrial networking and industrial automation, SCADA systems, DCS systems, PLCs, RTUs, large-scale automation, and the networks that are surround that for a better part of the decade, which led me to some realization about some of the security challenges that exist with protecting critical infrastructure, especially operational assets, and what really motivated me to found Xage about 10 years ago now.
Great. Thank you very much. We'll jump into the questions. So the next slide. And Daryl, this first question is primarily for you, and then we'll get input from Roman and John. So the first question is, the Department of War recently released the Zero Trust for OT guidance. From your perspective, why is the guidance such an important milestone for securing operational environments across defense infrastructure? What impact will this guidance have on project timelines, budgets, and actions?
Pat, this is really significant because this is one of the first policy documents that treats OT as OT, doesn't try and apply IT to the OT environment. Because as we know, applying the standard IT security approaches in OT environments can be ineffective and potentially dangerous. The guidance ties zero trust outcomes to operational realities and requires test-first validation, makes program owners document and justify exceptions. Since these environments are critical and many are safety related, solutions will be tested in controlled testbed environments. And so it may take a while to get implemented. Some of these systems are just so critical that you want to test them in an offsite first. Budgets will now need to include, the estimate of what it will be to deploy in the field, as well as a human in the loop costs. And so, we're going to be able to determine which of these security capabilities are most relevant to OT. It's significantly different from the fan chart, if you will, from the Zero Trust for IT. They had 150 activities. We have 105. About a half dozen are specifically designated for OT. They're not included in the IT fan chart. And, we have already learned from the intelligence community that applying zero trust works. We've had nation state adversaries kind of give off indicators that when they are trying to get after a network or an access point that has zero trust implemented, it is really hard, near impossible to get in. So we know it works. We are going to be held accountable to deploy this and roll it out from a prioritization scheme of obviously our most critical areas and networks that support those assets. And there's just a couple of very specific things I'd like to add that make this very unique. 3 things. So in the device pillar, network and discovery optimization, it adds that both passive and active discovery methods can be used depending upon the environment. And most IT environments, they're all using active discovery. Folks who are familiar with OT know that can be very problematic. In the data pillar, you can define with data tagging standards. Real-time data tagging may not work in operational environments, but could be applied to the data historian and then extracted from there. And then lastly, the visibility and analytics pillar, user device as a baseline. Well, those baselines, if they're linked to environmentals, it could take a whole year, I know, to establish that baseline. Whereas many folks in the IT community, hey, we need to have this in 30 days and then we're good to go. That may not work. So what's great about this is was specifically designed for OT and by the industry and government together to put this together. So that was really appreciative that the Zero Trust Office took input from industry and government to execute.
Excellent. Thank you.
You know,
Roman, do you have?
yeah, I would just like to add to that. So, it's great to see this type of comprehensive guidance coming out of Department of War. The focus here that's specifically on operational assets, and we're talking things like PLCs, RTUs, sensors, SCADA systems, DCS systems, all of which are used throughout the various deployments across the DoW. Another interesting thing is that the guidance focuses to a great extent. In fact, majority of the requirements here are all around, proactive controls, proactive protection of these types of assets. Means things like access controls, credential management, even talks about MFA and segmentation, least privilege, identity systems, all of which are core components for Zero Trust, and in fact, are the type of controls that are much needed in an operational space. There's some misconceptions that exist in the market, which we'll probably cover later on in this talk, where systems are currently isolated. They're not as isolated as we think, but Zero Trust is a control that enables protection, proactive protection, and actually simplifies that proactive protection, which is it's great to see this type of guidance coming out of the Department of War.
Great, thank you. And John, do you have any input there?
I do. Daryl and Roman both made some excellent points about how operational technology systems are fundamentally different from IT systems. If we look at why it's so important to provide this guidance, one of the things I fall back to is in terms of why it is so critical for us to protect these systems that are so different, not to treat them as IT assets, but to treat them as what they are and understand how to protect them. Look, my dad was a retired prison guard. And when it comes time for him to lock down cell block 8, and he pushes a button that automates locking down that cell block, he needs to be confident that the doors are going to close and they're going to lock. And that's what we're talking about when it comes to the reliability of operational technology systems. It's very easy to say that if an IT asset is compromised, we just take it offline. But what if we treated the prison door systems that way? Oh, we think this might be compromised. Let's take it offline. What do we do then? So that's why it's so critical that this guidance does exactly what it does. Like Daryl, you said, treat OT assets like they are. And it's so important to the Department of War because this is not a theoretical threat. We have seen nation-state actors actively using cybersecurity techniques as a prelude to kinetic activity. We saw this in both times when Russia invaded Ukraine. They started with cybersecurity effects to soften the battlefield, if you will, prior to a kinetic effect. They did the same thing in Crimea. And frankly, according to open source press, we have done similar things in both Operation Absolute Resolve in Venezuela and Epic Fury. It just makes sense, and it is part of the core of how a military fights, is to use cybersecurity capabilities in some cases against critical infrastructure that includes operational technology. So having this guidance on how to protect operational technology is vital to our national security interests.
Great. Thank you all for that. And we actually will go to the next slide for the next question. We touched on this a bit, but John, this one's primarily for you. Zero Trust starts with identity and access controls, which can apply to any environment. However, it's often discussed in the context of IT exclusively. How does implementing Zero Trust differ in OT and critical infrastructure environments, especially when protecting critical assets like sensors, mission-critical servers, essential systems such as power, water, fuel, and facility controls?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I'm glad we're dealing with this in this panel, because some of the fundamental differences of operational technology systems focus on this very thing. Many OT systems are older. They were never designed to operate in a modern IT infrastructure. But even the newer, more modern OT systems and IoT systems, Internet of Things systems like smart TVs, IP cameras, drones, etc., they need to be so lightweight that they cannot accept some of the more heavyweight protocols that we expect to see on an IT system. And what that translates to in terms of identity and access control is that we have to get creative in how we define the identity of an OT device and how we deal with those access control protocols so that they're in a lightweight enough manner that we're not getting in the way of them doing their job in a timely manner. So we have to rethink what Zero Trust means to a device that maybe cannot have a unique identity associated with it, or maybe cannot maintain strict non-repudiation of users, maybe because it's too lightweight, maybe because it's an older system and was never designed to do that, or maybe for operational concerns. Can you imagine being a first responder in an EMS unit and having to wait to log on to your device in order to try to save a person's life? And the answer is no, of course not. And we apply the same things to weapon systems if we look at Department of War, or we could look at sensors or any of those things. Some things have to be available all the time, and we can't even risk the time that it takes to log off and log on with the new shift change. So we have to rethink what that means to our overall Zero Trust strategies in terms of architecture, because as Daryl mentioned, OT systems, they're fundamentally different. They're not IT. So let's accept them for what they are and look at how to apply an architecture that makes sense for them in the environment that it makes sense for.
Thank you, John. Roman or Daryl, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'd like to add to that as well. I mean, I totally agree with what John's said. I also think the philosophy of zero trust in IT is different than the philosophy for zero trust for OT. So fundamentally, zero trust for OT does not have to come at the expense of a defense in depth type of an architecture, right? So when we think of zero trust in IT, we think, everything's cloud connected, there's flat networks, we're going to control access granularly and monitor that access to individual interactions, but it's sort of so there's not many layers of defense there. They're just a single layer. With OT, that architecture fundamentally doesn't work. Where OT systems have started, they're mission critical. Even a compromise in a single system can have devastating effects. So making sure that there are layers of protection in addition to granular access and identity-based access to systems, is critical. We don't want to, we can't afford a compromise even on a single system, right? The other point I'd like to mention here is in assets in operational environments are, in addition to being very heterogeneous, there's all sorts of different assets, as John said, they're also connected via all sorts of different networks, and they're spread out, can be spread out across large territories. They could be at remote sites, thousands of those remote sites. And those networks can have very intermittent connectivity. In fact, this concept of DDIL, denied, disrupted, intermittent, and limited, is critical in an operational state. You don't want to have a situation where, as John said, somebody's coming out to service or equipment out in a remote site and networks down. That's why they're there in the first place, because they can't reach it. When they get there, they can't log in, they can't access systems. That's gonna cause downtime. That's gonna cause mission failure just because of a security control that did not work. So in OT, security controls have to be distributed and operate in this highly autonomous manner as well.
Thanks.
So, yeah, I'd like to add that, what is really unique about Zero Trust is that it's got this new mindset of assuming breach. And that is not what the engineers designed in any of these systems. They did not think that an adversary was sitting on there. And that's why you've got a lot of tools and you've got recommendations in the architectures to have them segmented, right? And I definitely agree that the common practice of having one password and anyone can log on, everyone has admin rights. I mean, that needs to change, and then that will change as you apply the zero trust principle here. I think one of the things that we can do is everyone is already applying many hundreds of NIST security controls, and many of those do translate into how they support these zero trust families and activities. It's not a one for one, but we should be able to take credit for those activities that we're already doing. And the activities and outcomes document that provides that guidance shows, how well you're doing it, demonstrate that you're doing it more than just a checklist. I think those are some of the key differences.
Great. Thank you all. We'll go to the next slide. And this question is primarily for you, Roman, to start. Identity-based access is becoming a core element of OT security. How do you approach enforcing strong identity, authentication, and privilege access controls in environments where many devices were never designed with modern security in mind?
So identity and authentication and access management are really the core principles behind Zero Trust. And when we think about them in operational environment, we really need to consider the assets that the operation is using. These assets are designed to be there for really decades. It's not uncommon to see a PLC there that's been there for 20 plus years. Fundamentally, these assets cannot be changed. You cannot just inject identity-based controls into these assets. So what organizations have been doing in order to allow access, and access is important. Access to assets is needed in order to get data, to remotely to facilitate automation, data-driven automation as well, collaborate with service companies, and just optimize the whole operation. So they've been pulling together a number of various tools in order to facilitate this access, but at the same time protect the asset. So disjoint solutions like VPNs to allow access in some fashion. VPNs have huge, attack vectors, right? That just let you in into the entire network. So organizations been putting together jump boxes to start separating these networks. Well, that got very complicated very quick because these jump boxes themselves are typically vulnerable with thousands of accounts that haven't been well managed, and they're Windows machines and could be easily compromised. So then companies started adding password managers. So let's start finding a way to manage credentials across my PLCs and RTUs and SCADA systems. They quickly realized that there's thousands of them, and changing these credentials is really very difficult. They all use very, different methods. So they started then deploying more firewalls at the edge, and firewalls started having millions of rules, overlapping rules, and ultimately there's a rule that says allow all. So this disjoint mess of solutions, VPNs, jump boxes, password managers, more firewalls, VLANs, and ACLs, it's really not working. It gets complicated quickly and ultimately does not deliver on the zero trust outcome. So there are better approaches that exist to this that eliminate all this complexity. Typically, these approaches act as overlays. They establish identities and for various assets that they find in the environment. Then they establish policies, how users, machines, devices, applications are allowed to interact. And then they enforce those interactions using those identity perimeters, not network perimeters, for all sorts of interactions. So north, south, east, west, all of those interactions. These approaches are typically network overlays. They integrate built-in proxy technology, filtering technology, credential management technology, and they can be deployed. They can be deployed completely on site without dependencies on external, cloud systems or enterprise systems. And that's an important point. There is a strong, through line in the guidance from DoW, and that guidance is really to keep security controls from enterprise IT and OT systems completely separate.
Great. Thank you, Roman. Daryl, anything to add on that?
Well, certainly. So, I like what Roman was saying about, what compensating controls can you put in place? And he also mentioned, all these isolated environments. That's what a lot of OT folks have said. That's what we need to do to be in the best position against cyber attacks. And the National Security Agency, one of their best practices is to isolate the network. And so about 67% of all the systems that have gone through an authorization are isolated. So, somebody has to physically go out there to review, the kind of the status of that. And so that has obviously some positives and negatives to that. With regard to identity and access management there, you do have the opportunity to include some physical controls, right? So you could have a fingerprint scanner, facial recognition, or iris scanner in a critical area, and that's analogous to multi-factor authentication. You can also do proximity card readers, CAT cards. We just need to add that and add the permissions to it. You could even, you would think this is done everywhere, but it's not. There might not even be a visitor management system to track the visitors, their identity, and escort them while they're on site. And one of the things that we do is if there is a vendor who's going to be doing an update, they have to load that update on a government laptop before it gets entered in. So that's an extra level of control. And there are a number of other physical security aspects from fences and those sort of things, and those can work, but only if they're implemented. How many times have you gone and you found that the door propped open because the lock doesn't work or nobody has the keys, right? So there is a balance on making sure you have quick access and ensuring the right people have access.
Thank you. And John?
Yeah, I agree with all. You know, the interesting thing about identity-based access, and Daryl brought up some really interesting alternatives to what we traditionally think of as identity in in IT systems, things like compensating controls. Well, I'll throw out another option, which could also be behavioristic type identity. You know, Daryl, you had mentioned the quite natural thought of, well, if OT systems are such a threat, I'll just take them offline. I'll air gap them and never let them touch the network. And as you mentioned, that's not always really practical because in order to update those systems, you still have to touch a network, a device that touched a network. So by proxy, you're still connected. And a good example of this happening is with the centrifuges in Natanz, and apologies to Farsi speakers, I'm sure I butchered that word. But when the centrifuges suffered that breakdown because of the Stuxnet malware, you know, that's a great example of a completely air-gapped network. And it's still managed to get malware into that device at some point because, as we mentioned, the manufacturers of OT systems do not assume breach. But what if a system, an OT system that could not accept traditional identity packets were in place, but we were monitoring the behavior of that device and could tell that while this device is telling the world, hello, I'm just a simple water pump, pay no attention to me. But in the background, a passive tap on the network sees that that device is sending signals to the centrifuge control system. Why would a water pump be talking to the centrifuge? Well, that could have been a clue toward the actual identity of that water pump as being more than just a simple water pump. And we wouldn't have to use traditional IT-based access or IT-based identity protocols in order to monitor that behavior is different from what that device is projecting itself to be.
Great.
And I think that's an important distinction there for sure. I mean, I think that, the principle that I always use in OT is, unlike in IT where you really kind of need a network where anything talks to anything, and in OT you really need just a communications channel, right? So you
Yeah.
need a communications channel for specific interactions, so that that water pump should not really even have the ability to talk to anything else because it's really not required. So having that, proactive protection in the first place so that, you can't have an interaction unless it's specifically authorized, I think is more appropriate for OT, and then monitoring that interaction, as you said, John,
Yeah.
for consistencies. Yeah.
All right, let's move on to the next question. And this next question is for you, Daryl, on the primary side. How can organizations implement zero trust while maintaining uptime, safety, operational continuity, and what kinds of compensating controls can help them align with the intent of Department of War guidance?
Well, one of the things you've just got to do is you got to make sure that you're prioritizing what you're focused on. I mean, just we're not going to be able to do everything at once. And obviously, you want to know what the inventory is and, do that risk mapping. What is supporting the mission? How is that building HVAC system supporting the headquarters building, command and control, and how's that supporting the mission? And then determining where on the HVAC network you can put some of those controls. Unfortunately, one of the things that we keep finding is the as-is drawings of a lot of these OT networks are not being kept up to date as well as they should have. So you got to make sure that those are also accurate before just deploying something on something that may not be the right location. We went through and we learned that lesson on a pilot project to where three vendors put their boxes on a part of the network that allowed for horizontal exploitation because they had the wrong as-is drawings and they didn't realize until afterward. But anyway, so a couple options would be optimal would be to have a digital twin. And obviously that's where if you've got a whole brand new greenfield operation and you're able to budget for that, that would be amazing, right? There are lab environments that you can test these as well, and then, take them slowly. But again, you already are doing a number of these controls already if you've had to go through the risk management framework and those sort of things. But then, this technical implementation like digital twins or non-disruptive mediation is only half the battle. The other half is ensuring we have educated champions in the room when funding and governance is discussed so that OT safety and security will remain a priority. So you've got to, be mindful of the people who are also advising on which of these controls to implement.
All right, thank you. John, anything to add there?
Yeah, I would like to add to that because I think what's important is two things. The first thing is the most important step that any organization, particularly the Department of War, but any organization can take in implementing zero trust, especially in an environment like an OT environment. The most important thing they can do is start. Don't get locked in analysis paralysis. Do something. Get on the track to make improvements and start making those improvements quickly. Because that's the first thing. We can get vapor locked and wring our hands for years on this. And Daryl, I know you and I have talked about this in other conversations and forums in the past about how we've got to just we've got to make progress, which means we've got to start. If it's not perfect, that's okay. Let's start. The other thing that I think is important in terms of compensating controls is, I'm a Navy man by heart, active duty, served on ships, and then designed networks for the Navy for almost 20 years before my role at GDIT. So I always think like a ship, like damage control. So as a compensating control, Roman had mentioned segmenting networks, defense in depth as a viable compensating control in the past. We've got to be willing to look at our environment and make determinations of, as harsh as this sounds, which parts of the OT environment we can just let burn, because if there's a fire in that space, it's going to be harder to turn it off than to just lock the bulkhead door and let it burn itself out. And I think that the OT environment is one area where we can look at where we can prioritize some of those systems. If we see a compromise, as long as we isolate that compromise and don't let it get out to the broader environment, let's just let it burn and fix it later.
All right, Roman, anything to add there before we go to the next question?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that the other important thing that I'd like to mention here is that if from the guidance, it actually says things like decommissioning of assets which cannot be integrated with zero trust, decommissioning them eventually. And this is a big issue, right? Because fundamentally, decommissioning of these assets is often impossible, right? And will take a very long time because there are no replacements on the market that can support some of these controls. And decommissioning them will also cause downtime, and especially at the scale of thousands and thousands of these types of assets everywhere, and a heterogeneous mix of them from various vendors and also to different systems. Um, that does not mean, though, that some of these controls cannot be implemented, right? For example, the guidance calls out for MFA within the OT environment. Well, most PLCs don't support MFA, and they won't for a very, very long time. But it doesn't mean that PLC will have to be decommissioned. MFA can be today delivered as an overlay compensating control on top of the interaction. So whenever you have a interaction with an asset, you can deploy an overlay MFA solution that authenticates that interaction, that that user verifies their identity, their managed credential, forces an MFA check, and operates, in a completely disconnected environment. These types of solutions exist, and they can be deployed as an overlay. So much better than decommissioning of assets, which is quite complicated and costly.
Right, thank you. And we'll move on to the next question here. It's a two-parter. So John, you've got the first half of this question. What skill sets are required to operate and manage these initiatives? Will responsibility primarily fall to OT personnel, or will specialized cybersecurity expertise be needed?
Yeah, I think realistically, we need to think about upskilling the OT personnel, because as Daryl mentioned at the beginning of this panel, OT systems are fundamentally different from IT systems. I'm not saying that a cybersecurity person can't possibly understand what an OT system is meant to do, but the OT operators are going to be the ones who really understand the mission of that device. And they're going to be the ones best suited to understand what actions are going to have on the overall mission, and whether we fail safe, we fail secure, we fail open, or simply take the thing offline or let it burn. That's not a decision that I think a cybersecurity expert per se would be as well suited to make as an OT person. Now, conversely, we have to make sure that OT operators are willing and interested to take on that additional role, and that may be a challenge. But I think while both skills are needed, I personally feel that OT expertise probably is at least 51% of the requirement, more so than cyber. Daryl, I don't know if you would
Well,
challenge.
no, that's interesting, John. So, for years I've been asking audiences, who do you want to cyber protect the OT? Do you want the IT professional to learn OT, or do you want the OT person to learn cyber? And you'd get like one or two hands raised on either. And then when I offered that, how about a rainbow unicorn to come in and do it? Everyone would raise their hand. So, but it has now led more responses to say, hey, I think we can train the OT people in cyber, which is great. However, I still think we need the cyber people to say, this is the data we need to be able to understand what actions we can take. The OT people may not know that. So I agree, both are needed to help weigh in on that. I think the cyber people need to be direct and definitive on what cyber requirements they have, and the OT people can help implement that.
John has your cyber unicorn in his hand there.
That's right. Just happened to have one with me.
Perfect.
And we're running a little low on time, so we'll go, Roman. We're not going to give you a chance to add in there. We're going to go to your part of the question. So additionally, what role should vendors play in supporting these programs and ensuring that security guidance is properly implemented and validated?
I think here the vendors should really focus on really helping the organizations prioritize what's important. I see a common pitfall where with organizations wasting tremendous amount of time and resources ineffectively, where they deploy detection solutions way too early, right? They have a big attack surface, many assets, many interactions, and they start doing, passive or active monitoring, and then they get ton of data, and everything looks like an attack. And there are, lots of false positives. And then they throw people at that and they look at to analyze every single false positive, because you have to now. It's identified, and more resources get dedicated to this type of effort. It's too early to deploy a detection solution. To implement proactive controls first, and vendors should really help educating the customers that, look, in order to reduce that noise and amplify the signal, put some controls in place that limit interactions. So those interactions are, blocked by the system, whether it's from human, machine, or, device, on-site, remote. And that really simplifies the job to a big extent, because most of those interactions that are happening out there are already blocked. You don't need to be doing anything about it. And now you can identify what was an actual malicious interactions, an asset violating a policy, a user violating a policy intentionally, and focus on those types of things versus, this is a potential, false positive, something may be going on here. So use helping organizations use the limited resources they have, and the resources are quite limited, wisely, and prioritizing the sort of the sequence of the implementation of Zero Trust.
Yeah, and so if just to like jump in, GSA has said that there will be no one solution that does all of Zero Trust, and so that's where it's going to be really important for vendors to show which specific Zero Trust families and activities that they excel at and do well, and look for collaboration with other solution providers to do that full suite.
Excellent. Thank you. And yeah, we're running low on time, so we're gonna move over to some of the Q&A from the audience and open those questions. I'll ask one of you to answer the question. So we've got the first one in here. How do you measure success or maturity when implementing Zero Trust in OT environments, especially given the phased approach and use of compensating controls? Anybody want to take that one?
I'll just jump in. As I mentioned earlier, we are already doing hundreds of security controls. So I think identifying a way to take credit for what you're already doing with some of those to meet some of the Zero Trust, find a way to get like a third-party validation in that. And again, start off slow, doing some of the easy ones first, but then build out a detailed plan that you'll need to later achieve.
All right.
I would
Go ahead.
also like to add with that, and this is kind of similar to what I said in the past, is, use your resources wisely, and, shake off some of those IT habits, right? So if some of the, IT type of habits is, do detection and anomaly detection and monitoring type of things first, and, that's costly, right? And ineffective if you do it too early. The other one that is, patch everything, over rotating on patching everything. In OT, patching doesn't work the same way as it is in IT. Most systems out there don't have patches that exist. The other thing is, patches have to be tested extensively before they can be rolled out into these environments. Because if you roll out a patch which can introduce an issue, it can take down the whole operation, and those are mission critical systems. And as a result, patch cycles are only once or twice a year, and you're often patching things with with releases that already have vulnerabilities already discovered, and you're way behind on patching. So patching over rotation on patching is really ineffective. And especially now with AI, this recent discoveries with AI is that, AI can find vulnerabilities much more effectively and develop exploits for those vulnerabilities very quickly. So, put more proactive controls in place that are limit exposure of the asset in the first place using techniques like MFA, microsegmentation, credential management. Most attacks are happening because of lack of those controls, and that creates the defenses that you already have in place. Then you can put the proper monitoring and patching on your own schedule.
All right. Well, we'll take this last question over to John. Can you share examples of common pitfalls or mistakes organizations make when trying to apply IT-focused zero trust principles directly to OT environments?
Yeah, and I think we've discussed a few of these over the course of this panel. So I'll just throw out a couple. Common pitfall is to assume that the knee-jerk reaction of, "Oh, I think this is compromised, take it offline." That's probably the biggest mistake you can make with regard to OT systems. Some of these are many are safety-related systems. You can't just take those safety systems offline.
Right.
We don't want planes falling out of the air or prison doors suddenly swinging open when they should be closed because, hey, we thought it was compromised, so we didn't know what to do. That's one. And I think another is, and this is where we go back to the core of the first question, this guidance regarding zero trust for OT by treating OT systems as OT systems, like Daryl mentioned, rather than force fitting an IT-based zero trust model. You can do more damage than good by trying to force fit the wrong model, the wrong heavyweight model onto systems that require by nature a much more lightweight protocol and a lightweight approach.
All right. Anybody else have any additions?
I'll quickly just add, I mentioned don't assume that the as-is drawings are correct. So you got to verify those before you're doing any of this work.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would underscore that as well, to sort of validate the intention of the system, the way that it's supposed to operate, and the sort of the connections that it requires, and implement controls around all of those assets and the various interactions that are required and limited to that sort of. It's a completely different. It's a purpose-built system of systems. It's not a any-to-any networks, which requires a completely different type of an approach and thinking.
That's right, Roman. You definitely need to apply a system of systems level thinking approach when looking at this. And that's a different way of thinking.
That's right.
Right. All right. Well, thank you to Daryl, John, and Roman for taking time to speak on this important topic for the Department of War OT guidance. Thank you to the audience for watching and engaging. If you'd like to learn more about how Xage maps to the Department of War's Zero Trust for OT mandate, I encourage you to check out our capabilities mapping document, which is available for download within the webinar portal, and you'll be sent a copy following after the session concludes. So thank you all very much. And I'm sure we'll see you around the Beltway and other words around the globe.
Yeah, appreciate the opportunity. Awesome.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
John, Daryl, Pat. It was great.